Welcome to the It's Time podcast with your host, Professor Dale Feinauer from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh College of Business Graduate Programs.
Welcome to another It's Time podcast, a presentation of the UW-Oshkosh College of Business Graduate Programs. Once again, we're here at A.J. Armstrong Studios recording this podcast. Hopefully again today we'll throw some more fuel on the fire of your desire to learn more about how to enhance your leadership capacities. Today's another one of those days where you get me. This isn't a guest podcast. This is Dale reefing on about leadership and in particular about conflict and the role of conflict in leading an organization. We're going to think a little bit about historical views of conflict, how we viewed conflict in organizations, why I think that historical view is wrong. We're going to think about, is conflict a good thing or a bad thing in organizations? Think a little bit about how individuals respond to conflict, how people respond to conflict differently in different situations, and what we can learn from that to help manage conflict in an organization. We're going to think about how to successfully manage conflict in an organization, how to use conflict in an organization. We will think some about how to resolve conflict if it has become undesirable. Conflict. One of the things I would note is that I did do a TED Talk, Oshkosh TED Talk, why conflict is a good thing. So if you don't have time to listen to this, it's probably going to be an hour and a half podcast broken up into two pieces. Just find the 20-minute TED Talk and that'll be the summary of it. Let me talk a little bit though before we get started about the TED Talk experience. I have been very impressed with what happens when you do a TED Talk. When you do a TED Talk, you got 20 minutes. That's it, 19 actually, to do the presentation. I can talk about conflict for days. I do. We teach this in our executive MBA program, and we'll spend 3+ Saturdays, 4 hours a day, 12 hours talking about the role of conflict in leading an organization. Now you got 19 minutes. I have been very impressed in that experience, and it's reinforced other observations as I thought about it. The advantage of doing things short of being brief. Finding a way to boil it down to its essentials. So it's kind of a conflict topic. How do you deal with the conflict of making it short? How do you take this thing that you wanted to do and spend 2 hours talking about, you now have 10 minutes, you now have 20 minutes. It's your elevator speech. Interestingly, when I give assignments in class, I certainly no longer have a required page limit that says it has to be at least 15 pages. I think that's one of the worst things we ever did in educational systems to people in terms of learning how to write. Write something on your summer vacation, has to be at least 10 pages. My assignments go the other way around. Got to write a report. I want you to summarize, I want you to tell me all about boom, 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 make a recommendation about this. You get no more than 5 double-spaced pages. I am convinced that when we try to do things short, it is harder to do that, but it forces us to get to the essentials. It reminds me of a quote that I particularly like, a line, I guess I should say, I particularly like. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams had this great relationship when they were younger, a very testy relationship when Adam was president, and then Jefferson became president, effectively beating Adams, and there was real tension between the two of them. But later in their lives, they had this great correspondence and went back and forth. At the bottom of one of Jefferson's letters to Adams, he penned a little postscript. I apologize for the length of the letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one. And I would argue that often in organizations, one of the problems we have in leadership, we're too long. We think about it maybe too much. We make it too complicated. If you really understand the dynamics in an organization, you can simplify it down a couple sentences, a couple paragraphs, make it tight. So it's a challenge I give you all when you're struggling with something and you're dealing with 20 different aspects of it. Can you boil it down to the essentials? All right, let's talk about conflict. which I will not do as short as I maybe have just suggested we should do. Historically, how have we viewed conflict? We view conflict in an organization as an undesirable thing. Historically, we in the business arena, in the business education arena, when we talked about conflict, we indicated that's a bad thing. If there's conflict in your organization, you're screwing up. There shouldn't be conflict. And back in the 70s, when I was getting my graduate education, 80s, the thinking was, okay, you have an organization, there's an organizational hierarchy. People at the top of the organizational hierarchy identify the goals, the objectives, the things that need to be done. And you've got that traditional pyramid organizational chart. And people at this level tell people at this level, tell people at this level what to do. Everybody is told what to do, the specifics of what they need to accomplish. Everybody does as they're told. Why should there be any conflict? Thinking went, if there's conflict, the only reason there is conflict is because somebody wasn't clear on what the expectations were, or somebody's not following through on meeting their expectations. Both bad things. So historically, we viewed conflict as an indication of bad management. That evolved. In the 70s, later in the 80s, we started to really understand that we wanted to get more employee involvement in organizations, and that as organizations changed, there would inevitably be some conflict. So this evolved our thinking about conflict from it's inherently a bad thing to it's not desirable, but we understand that it happens. There will be conflict because there will be times when there is change. Change drives conflict. There will be times that there will be conflict because multiple employees will have disagreements as we're getting them all engaged in thinking about the organization, thinking about how to approach a problem. There is a new school of thought that says conflict is desirable, and I am largely of this school of thought. That conflict has a bunch of advantages to it, and that the absence of conflict has a lot of disadvantages to it. And I'm in both of those schools of thought. So first, the advantages. Conflict creates energy and motivation and jazz. Ask yourself the question, if you played sports, when you were playing that sport, did that create energy? Did that create motivation? It's a great movie thing where there's the big game, and before the big game, the coach comes in and gives you this rah-rah speech to get you all motivated to play the big game. I don't know that that's true or is necessary. My impression is that in the vast majority of cases, before the big game, before something that is going to involve some conflict, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of motivation, there's a lot of jazz, because that's what happens when the adrenaline flows that's associated with there being conflict. The fight or flight response gets stimulated, and there's a lot of energy to that. There's a lot of motivation to that. That has some real advantages if we can properly harness it in organizations. Conflict creates creativity. I think some of the most creative solutions that people come up with, they come up with under the stress, if you will, under the focus of conflict. I'm currently working on developing a new master's in business leadership, and I say I, and I really mean a whole group of folks. But I'm the one who's trying to pull the thing together. And I'm getting lots of folks giving me input on what this potential master's in business leadership ought to look like, that are providing criticisms, limitations to various versions of this thing that I've developed. And every one of those versions creates a challenge. It's like, we don't like the fact that it doesn't look like this. We don't like the fact that it looks like that. Here's some aspect of it that we think is a limitation. Well, I could get mad at all of those, or I could creatively drop back and think about, okay, yeah, that's a legitimate point. That's good. How do I creatively modify the proposal to take into account that consideration? Now, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you got to go back and say, hey, here's a concern you had, and the answer is I can't figure it out. But it certainly can motivate creativity. Conflict can increase group cohesion. If there is a group of folks that as a group are faced with conflict from an outside entity, if you will, that tends to increase the cohesion of the group. I've never been in combat. I've effectively never been in the military. But my understanding from talking to folks who've been in the military, and particularly folks who've been in combat, is that in some ways it is the most cohesive activity they've ever engaged in. That folks who have had to suffer through the horrors of being in conflict have also experienced some of the greatest unity within a group of individuals. That it's possible that conflict can be very disuniting. We will talk about that. But conflict and the threat coming from the outside driving that conflict can be a great source of creativity and a great source of cohesion within the group. We all need to work very hard together to overcome this obstacle. It can open up communication. When there is conflict, if properly managed, individuals are communicating more. They're talking about what their limitations are, what the concerns are, what their frustrations are about a scenario. Again, if managed well, conflict can increase ownership of the decision. I participated in the decision making. I engaged in some conflict around this decision. I believe that I was heard. I believe that I had impact. I believe that the thing that is being proposed reflects at least some of my considerations and my concerns. I now have more ownership of that because we've been able to have this discussion, this debate, and move on. I would argue that in many relationships, having had conflict strengthens the quality of the relationship. I was talking, this was actually before the podcast, with Tim Bergstrom, before he did a podcast, and he talked about the fact that at Bergstrom, they've learned and they focus on recovery from a mistake. Conflict is a great way to build customer relationship. If I don't get this thing to you at a particular time when I promised that, that's not good. We didn't get the oil sealed properly when we did the oil change, so oil leaked on your garage floor. If we can recover from that well, we do a good job of we're going to take care of that problem in a way that if anything is above and beyond, that conflict, instead of creating division, creates more unity, creates more ownership of the situation, creates a greater feeling of connection within the organization. Interestingly, within the United States government, we intentionally use conflict in a number of situations. And I think those situations and how that plays out is interesting. For one thing, in national security, we used to have scenarios, if you go back to the Kennedy administration, where the President of the United States got a single unified suggestion on a national security issue. For example, the Bay of Pigs. When President Kennedy was getting advice from the best and the brightest, it's a wonderful book, with regard to do you or do you not invade Cuba with these exiles that the CIA had trained, everyone pretty much said yes. There were people who maybe had a little mild hesitation, but basically all of his advisors said do the deal. And it turned out to be a disaster. And when they analyzed after the fact what happened and what went wrong, a number of people talked about what their reservations were that they hadn't talked about before the deal went down. Now what happens in national security is conflict. There is always conflicting advice. The President of the United States does not get unified advice from the National Security Group. Everybody says, we ought to do X. No debate about it. X is the answer. This is what you should do. There's always debate. The Israelis have a rule. If 10 Israeli generals get together and all 10 of them think the answer is A, one of those generals is assigned to make the argument that A is a bad idea. The argument being that in these national security decisions, it is too important to allow what we call groupthink to occur. We need to have a dissenting voice. We need to have multiple perspectives because the reality is we make better decisions after conflict. One of the huge advantages of conflict is that it does improve the quality of our decision making. Now, not only does that happen in national security issues, it also happens in our court system. If you think of the criminal and the civil property rights questions that are adjudicated by our justice system, those are fundamentally resulting from a function of conflict. Attorney comes in from side A and makes the argument this contract is enforceable or that this individual is guilty. Attorney comes in from side B and makes the argument, no, I don't think this contract is enforceable. Here's why. I think this person is innocent. Here's why. The two sides fight. They debate. They have conflict over what the right answer is. And a judge or a jury, listening to that conflict, then come to the conclusion of what the right answer is. National security, our judicial system are both predicated now on conflict is essential to making really good decisions. So the argument is conflict is not only desirable, but conflict is in effect necessary for a healthy organization. If you don't have conflict, if you never fight about the right answer, you got a problem because you're going to get groupthink. You're going to get the group moving as a herd, and sometimes those lemmings will move in the good direction, but sometimes they will make mistakes, and then you're going to be all in on the mistake. So you have to find a way to encourage conflict in your organization to debate important issues and challenges within the organization. So conflict, I am convinced, is an important, inevitable thing in organizations. You want to have conflict. Having said that, can conflict be a bad thing? And the answer is absolutely yes. And I'm sure a number of you are thinking, well, wait a minute, he's talking about how wonderful conflict is. I can remember conflict that I was in. It was an absolute disaster. It was terrible for the organization or for individuals in a non-work relationship. Absolutely. Conflict can be, in the terminology of the conflict arena, functional or dysfunctional. Dysfunctional conflict is bad. Dysfunctional conflict is conflict that reduces a team's ability to get things done. So the nature of the interaction between individuals on the team, instead of resulting in better decisions and more cohesion, and we're better at making a decision, we result in an answer that has greater support from the team, somehow that conflict reduces the team's ability to get things done. It can result in crushing an individual. The individuals, as a result of the conflict, feel beat up on. They feel less willing to participate in the team. They go and hide in their hole. They want to dive. They want to get away. They're tired of being beat up on, and they're trying to escape from an unhealthy work environment. Absolutely, that can occur. Conflict can devolve into what we call win-lose thinking. Ideally, we want to engage in win-win analysis. Player A wants one thing, player B wants another in the organization. They're not on the same page. All right, well, let's think about how can we think about what player A wants? How can we think about what player B wants? How can we get the best from both worlds? It's one of the things we talk about in leadership. Should we focus on taking the hill, the mission, etc.? Should we focus on empathy and taking care of the employees, the troops, if you will, using the military analogy? Well, if you focus too much on A or too much on B, you run into a problem. And if you are so much on all we're worried about is taking the hill and just no longer concerned about people's well-being, people are going to feel crushed. They're going to want to leave. They're not going to want to engage in win-win thinking. They're not going to try and figure out, how can I get what I want, what I think is important for the organization, and also figure out how to get as much of what person B wants. This other person, they got a different solution than I have. They're looking at this thing differently. They're taking a different vantage point on this. How do I drop back, take a deep breath, learn from them, and how can we come up with a solution that incorporates the best of what one person wants, the best of what another person wants? How can we engage in win-win thinking? And arguably, dysfunctional conflict moves us from win-win thinking to win-lose. I want to win, and I want to see you lose. I ask the question of you in terms of sports. When you are watching a sporting event, is it always the case that you're rooting for Team A to win? Or are there some teams you root against, and you just like watching that team lose? Because You don't like the team. You don't like the coach. You don't like one of the players. I'm a graduate of The Ohio State University. And often I should root for Michigan because Michigan doing well, Michigan, being highly ranked when Ohio State and Michigan play is good for Ohio State, etc. I try, but I really don't. I can't. I enjoy watching Michigan lose. You can devolve from win-win to win-lose. You want to see the other player lose. And I'm convinced in organizations we get to lose-lose. I'm convinced we have in organizations employees who are so frustrated with our organization, so frustrated with their leadership, so frustrated with their team that they want at least part of the organization to fail. And they will enjoy watching the organization fail. Oh, the bright boys and girls run the organization think we ought to do A. I could have told them A was a bad idea. And now I would very happily enjoy watching A be a disaster. And I'd actually give a couple of nudges to make A become a disaster. And if that means I don't get the raise I'd hoped for, if that means something bad happens to me, I'm willing to take an ounce of pain if it can inflict a pound of pain on somebody else. I think we get in organizations to the point where I am so frustrated with the conflict that has occurred, I want to see others in the organization. Maybe I want to see the organization fail and lose because it'll just feel good. And even if it costs me something to do it, I'm willing to bear that cost. And now, a few words about some of the programs and services offered by the UW-Oshkosh College of Business.
Students in the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh MBA Executive Program get a first-hand look at global business in action during a 10-day international study tour, visiting 2 countries and exploring diverse cultures around the world. Rated one of the most impactful elements of the executive program, cohorts have toured top-tier businesses in Accra, Ghana, Beijing, China, Nagasaki, Japan, Panama City, Panama, Seoul, South Korea, Stockholm, Sweden, and more. Be part of something bigger than yourself and experience education beyond classroom walls. Connect with an MBA advisor today by emailing mba@uwosh.edu to learn more about the MBA Executive Program and upcoming international study tours. That's mba@uwosh.edu. It's time to achieve more.
We can get dysfunctional conflict that has all of these terrible ramifications. What's the key? What makes dysfunctional conflict separate from what we'll talk about next, functional conflict, that has all the positive advantages we already talked about? Dysfunctional conflict becomes personal. If I disagree with your position, you think we ought to do A, I think we ought to do B. I think this person ought to be elected, you think that person ought to be elected. And we are debating and disagreeing over, having conflict over who would make the better candidate, which is the better solution. We're probably still in functional conflict. Once it's devolved to, I dislike you, you're wrong, your idea is stupid, you're only saying that because, across organizations, I'm on third shift. You're only saying that because you're on first shift and you don't understand third shift. You're an idiot. I'm an academic by training. Do I sometimes get people telling me, Dale, you only think that because you're an academic? Oh, no, wait a minute. If you think I got a bad idea, explain to me why the idea is wrong. If it is only, oh, you're an academic, that feels like you're attacking me as a person. So we need to find ways to avoid it getting dysfunctional, which means we need to find a way to avoid conflict degenerating to that level of being personal. If we can do that, we can focus on functional conflict. Functional conflict. We are focused on issues, not on personalities. I'm not mad at somebody else. I am trying to find ways to make this thing happen. We're focused on the debate, not letting it bleed into the relationship. I disagree with you, but let's talk about it. I want to better understand your perspective. I want to better understand your view. That's a great way to go into functional conflict and get all the benefits we had talked about. The key is keeping the conflict away from the personal. Don't take it personal. There's a quote of Colin Powell that I you're going to hear me use this over and over in these podcasts because it's so important in so many arenas. Never let your ego be so closely tied to an idea that a failure of the idea is a failure of you. If I'm going into this conflict and my ego is so closely tied to this idea, anybody who puts up a limitation to the conflict, oh, they're attacking me, and then I'm going to attack them, and it gets personal, now you've moved into dysfunctional conflict. You have to find a way to keep the conflict focused on the issue, focused on the ideas, focused on the challenges your organization has. Make sure as a leader you keep your focus there, not on personalities. Once it focuses on personalities, we're going to get into trouble. And we'll think more in a little bit about how to think about keeping the organization in a functional versus a dysfunctional mode. Part of it is that you need to celebrate when those disagreements occur. So we'll talk more about this in a minute, but I want to give one example first. I became a leader, I think I was director at the time, of graduate programs for the College of Business. And I was probably the second staff meeting we were at, and I'm in charge, and I'm running the staff meeting, and I'm a PhD faculty member, which sort of has status and stuff within the university. And there are a bunch of staff that are, quote, reporting to me that are there. And we're talking about whatever, some issue. And then it comes up to a question of marketing. And I suggest to the group, maybe particularly to our marketing person, that we should put more focus on promoting the faculty in our marketing. And I'm explaining why I think this is a good idea, this is important, because the faculty are what makes the difference, and that's why people go and get their degrees from us, is because we have great faculty, et cetera, et cetera. One of the staff, Tara Larson, wonderful employee, looks at me and very respectfully, very appropriately says, Dale, I think you're wrong. I don't think that's what we ought to encourage focusing on in our promotional material. I don't think folks go to the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh because they believe we have good, bright, creative, compassionate faculty. I'm listening. She goes on. I think all universities have good, bright, creative faculty. And differences in faculty are really not a reason why people choose institution A over institution B. So here it is, one of my first meetings. We've had our first conflict where one of my, quote, direct reports says, Dale, respectfully, but says, Dale, I think you're wrong. How do you respond to that? As I recall, I stood up and started clapping. And I made a big point of the fact that this is great. Conflict is a wonderful thing. As a leader in an organization, you need to be finding ways to promote conflict is a good thing, and you're receptive to it. You as a leader would far prefer to have somebody come to you and say, hey, Dale, I think you're getting ready to do something that doesn't make sense. It's going to be a mistake. I maybe don't want them to use the term, but you're going to be getting ready to do something dumb. Let's talk about it. I'd far rather have that than somebody come to me and say, Dale, I think you just did something dumb. But I'd even prefer that than they didn't say anything at all and I just did something stupid and didn't realize it. You need to find ways to encourage your people to it's okay to challenge you. As a leader, you need to be strong. You need to be aggressive. You need to be assertive. You need to be in charge. But you need to do all that within the context of still letting people, I think this is not the right answer and let's talk about it. That's a balance that's very important for people to find when they're figuring out how to be a leader. Particularly a challenge for you young leaders. You have to be in charge, but you also have to be willing to listen. And balancing those two can be a difficult challenge. But let's think a little bit about responses to conflict. And then we'll get back to how we structure conflict in an organization to make it work. How do we respond to conflict? The literature on this, when you read and you think about how people respond to conflict, there really are two questions about how you would respond to a particular conflict. One question is, how assertive are you? How strongly are you stating your position? I think this is the right answer. This is why I think it's the right answer. Let me articulate what I think the answer is, why I think it's an important answer. That's assertive. And you can be highly assertive, you can be highly unassertive. You could be highly cooperative, All right, let's try and figure out what a solution is. Let's all work together. Let's find a way to compromise, make this thing work. Or you could be relatively uncooperative. I've explained what I want. If I don't get what I want, I'm going to go away mad. Or at least I'm not going to cooperate with this solution. You can be highly assertive, highly unassertive, highly cooperative, highly uncooperative. And this effectively makes a 2x2 grid because you can be any combination of these. And what I'd like to think about here for a minute is each of these four possibilities and why that occurs. And I want to put the focus on the why, because some of these are better in organizations than others, and one of them in particular is very frustrating for leaders. But I don't think people generally fall into one of these four camps and that's just what they do because that's who they are, personality. There's some of that. But I think much more so, it's a function of the environment. There are the good tests you can take that determine how much you're competitive, how much you're assertive, how much you're unassertive, how much you're collaborative, how much you're uncollaborative in dealing with conflict. My experience has been you take that questionnaire and you do it in environment A, you're going to have a different answer than if you did it in environment B. And so we're going to have to think about that as we go along. And that means that the environment really drives a lot of how people respond to conflict. So if you've got employees that aren't responding to conflict the way you would like, I understand getting frustrated with them, but maybe you first ought to get frustrated with you and ask the question, am I creating a work environment that encourages this type of conflict, which I don't like? Do I really understand why they're taking this approach to conflict? Let's go with the first one, competitive, highly assertive, and uncooperative. I want X. I think X is the right answer. If I don't get X, I'm going away mad. I'm not playing. Why would somebody take that approach? And many of you may think, well, that's not a very good answer. You shouldn't be uncooperative. You should be trying to figure out how to make it work. I would contend that all of you, I would hope that all of you, in some cases, would be highly assertive and highly uncooperative. And I can think of two very sound, rational reasons why people take this approach. First, it's an ethical question. There are some issues and challenges in organizations that I'm going to be highly assertive and uncooperative about. Look, we're not going to do that. I'm not going to be with that program. I think that's going to violate the law. I think that's going to create a tax liability. I think it's unethical. I'm not going to support, under the contract we could do that, but that's not really the understanding we have with this customer, with this client, with a supplier, with whoever. We ought to do the right thing. Doing that is not the right thing. And there ought to be some things in life that you are committed enough to because they're the right thing that you say, no, I'm not going to do that. I can't be supportive of doing X because I just don't think it's the right thing to do. You're going to be highly assertive and you're going to be highly uncooperative. The other situation where you might be highly assertive and uncooperative is where you think this is a really important decision. The consequences of getting it wrong are significant to your organization, and you're really convinced you know what you're talking about. I've been at the university almost 40 years now. So we have issues and challenges as we do in any organization. But as with many organizations, these issues and challenges are in some cases repetitive. They come, they're cycles. We do A, we move to B, we move back to A. This happens in organizations all the time. And there are times when individuals will suggest a course of action. And I think to myself, that's not going to work. I was here when we tried that before and it failed. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily I oppose it. That doesn't mean I go to assertive and uncooperative. I may just say, well, here's a couple downsides. We tried that before, it didn't work, X. But it may be that I go to assertive and uncooperative if I'm convinced it will not work and I'm convinced the cost is going to be too high. So in an organization, if you are convinced that the organization, this proposal is a bad idea or is a great idea, and you think the consequences of not doing it or doing it would be huge, You might very well be highly assertive and uncooperative. That's understandable. That's not a bad thing. That's you're committed to the organization. That's you're committed to your ethics. So if you're a leader and you've got a subordinate who's being highly assertive and uncooperative, or if you're a leader who's going to your leader, your boss, and being highly assertive and uncooperative, I would try to focus on the why. Ethically, I have a problem with doing this because, from my perspective, having been around for a while in the organization, having what I perceive to be expertise in this area, I think that's a mistake, and I think it will be costly if we do that, or it will be costly if we don't do that, and here's why. As a leader, I'm inclined to put a lot of focus on the why for the highly competitive, assertive, and uncooperative employee, and try and understand why they're coming from this perspective. And if at all possible, I'm going to try and give them what they want. Because I might be able, by sheer power in the organization, to force them to accept this solution. But if they really don't want to, that's going to be a very costly thing in the organization. Now, sometimes you have no choice. But I would try very much to find a way to give them what they want. Now, let me throw in a very important caveat on this. I would do this assuming this assertive and uncooperative approach is a relatively unique event. If they take assertive and uncooperative to every decision that comes down the pike constantly, I would absolutely not take the approach of trying to constantly give to them. There, I would sit down and have a very hard conversation around, look, this is not a successful way to approach conflict in this organization. In the long term, it will not be tolerated. In many cases, this turns out to be a personality trait which just isn't going away. So I would reference you back to the first podcast dealing with dead wood. If this is a person's go-to style for every conflict all the time, I think you're going to find they're toxic in your organization and you really need to find a way to get them out. Now let me deal with the other extreme of this, another approach, very different, unassertive and cooperative, referred to as accommodating. This is a scenario where an employee says, look, I don't care. We can do A or B. I don't care. Doesn't matter to me. And I'll really help and support A or B, whichever you decide. My impression is we don't do this nearly enough in organizations. This is, I think, a great approach for leaders and employees to take in an organization under some circumstances. If this is a scenario where it may be outside of my expertise, it's a scenario where I really don't think there's much difference between A or B. I don't care. I think we could do A. I think we could do B. I think both have limitations. I think both can be successful. I can be supportive of either. Within organizations, we often try to do more consolidation and less consolidation. So in the university environment, we can move to relatively stronger departments and relatively fewer decisions being made at the college level, or more decisions being made at the college level, fewer decisions being made at the department level. And you can move back and forth between those two. And I see advantages and disadvantages to both. But there are times when, having been there since dirt was invented, new, younger folks are coming in and they want to shift the focus from A towards B, whichever it is. They're moving it from what it is now to a different model, and they think that's a better approach. My answer is almost always yes. I may think, well, A is just as good as B. I really don't think this matters. But if they're young, bright, engaged folks who want to move from A to B, I'm inclined to say yes, because I really don't think it matters. I don't have a lot of skin in the game in terms of A or B, and I want them to have skin in the game, and I want to build relationship. And I don't think we do enough of this in organizations. Approach an issue and say, is this really one that I care about? And I see people getting this wrong in organizations all the time. It's an issue that isn't of particular importance to them. It's an issue that they don't own a lot. They maybe don't have a lot of expertise around. But when it comes up for discussion, they jump in, they engage, they take a position, they debate, they fight, etc. In many cases, in my mind, it's more important to get the chips than it is to have the debate. In relationships, in my mind, individual calls and says, Dale, I want to talk about some issue, something that's important. I help run our graduate programs. Head of HR for a large company calls me and says, Dale, I think we want to start working the EMBA program into our professional development process, and we want to think about how we can collaborate with your EMBA program. Okay, that's great. That's wonderful. The employee says, that this employer, this VP of HR, whoever says, okay, let's go out to eat. How about restaurant X? Well, let's assume I really don't like restaurant X. What's my answer? Yes, great, wonderful. I'd love to go to restaurant X. Because the relationship is so much more important to me than that specific. I think in organizations, while that's an extreme easy example, we're not quick enough to drop back and say, this really isn't nearly as important to me as it is to other people. Let me give on this issue and help build relationship, put some chips in the bank, if you will, and build that relationship. Let me save myself for some issue that I care more about in the future. Avoidance, unassertive and uncooperative. Passive aggressive, it's sometimes described as. This is the one that drives you nuts. This is the one that as a leader you find exceedingly frustrating. There's conflict in the organization. We're maybe making a change. You go in, you explain to people, okay, we're thinking about making this is a change, this is a new direction, this is the approach, any feedback, any comments, any analysis, and the employee just sits there. No reaction. You okay with this? Yeah, sure, fine, whatever. But then they don't do it. Unassertive, but uncooperative. We have a new process for reporting your expenses. You're supposed to fill out the form a different way. Great, fine, fill out the form a different way. But then when they get the form, they keep filling it out the old way. The employee who doesn't fight with you about the change, but also doesn't make the change happen. This drives leaders nuts. This is exceedingly frustrating. Nurses in hospitals are often used as a textbook example of this passive-aggressive approach. That the organization says we're going to change the procedures, the nurses don't publicly resist and fight about it, but they also don't do it. Well, let's think about this approach for a minute. Why would somebody take this approach? Why would you take this approach? And a lot of people are like, well, no, I would never do that. I wouldn't be unassertive and uncooperative. I'd own what my thinking is. I'd be upfront about this. I'd have this debate. I would make the argument that all of us have at some times been unassertive and uncooperative. And I would point to this question. When you were a kid, did you have a curfew? Was there a time you needed to be in? My guess is for many of you, you had a curfew. Well, were you necessarily going to debate with your mom, your dad about what that curfew should be? So you wanted to stay out later than curfew. Was your go-to approach saying, okay, I'm going to debate with mom and dad about the curfew? I'm guessing in many cases not. You weren't assertive. You were unassertive about what you thought made sense as a curfew because you knew if you had a debate with the old man about when curfew ought to be, all it was going to do is aggravate him. He was going to be laying in wait, making damn sure you got home in time for curfew. No, that's not what you did. I know what you did. What you did was be unassertive. You left the house. You went to the party. You sat there at that party. Your curfew was 10:30. You knew the house was 15 minutes. The party was 15 minutes from your house. 10:15. Did you get in the car and go home? No. You stayed at the party. Came home late. Unassertive, uncooperative. I believe all of us, under the right set of circumstances, will be unassertive and uncooperative. Now let's think a little bit about why. And I think for organizations, the why is very important. I believe there are two big reasons why people are unassertive and uncooperative. Reason number one, I do not believe we could have a useful discussion debate on the topic. I didn't believe I could sit down with my father and have a discussion about what was a reasonable, from my perspective, curfew time. I didn't think that would be productive at potentially moving the needle, so I dodged the conversation. If I don't believe I can walk into my boss's office and have a debate, Say, Dean Rao, I don't think that makes sense. I'd rather do A. I'm proposing B. If I don't think I can have that conversation with her, which I absolutely believe I can on damn near anything, but if I didn't believe I could have that conversation with her without her yelling at me, without my getting in trouble, without it costing me chips, I'm not going to do it. If you're the nurse in the hospital and you're disagreeing with a doc about something, if a nurse and a surgeon have a disagreement, who wins? The surgeon wins. Surgeon wins every time. Why? Because they're the surgeon. Not necessarily because they got the right answer. Hospitals back up surgeons before they back up nurses, because surgeons are prima donnas up the food chain in all too many cases. In organizations, if I do not believe I can have a good, useful, productive discussion of something, I will duck having the discussion. I will be unassertive. There is no reason for me to be assertive. There's no advantage to it. It's only going to cost me within the organization. You can't blame me for being unassertive. You've created an environment for which being unassertive is a reasonable, rational approach. Uncooperative. Why would I be unassertive and then also uncooperative? I'm going to be uncooperative. I'm going to ignore that rule if I am convinced that it ain't ever going to make any difference. I don't think you're ever going to know if I don't follow the rule. And even if you know I don't follow the rule, I don't really think there's anything you're going to do to me. I don't think you're going to bust me for coming home late for curfew. I think I can make it home and make it upstairs, go to bed without my mom and dad ever knowing I'm home late. My dad slept soundly. My mom would wake up, but we had a little system. She would turn on the porch light before she would go to bed. I would turn off the porch light when I came home. Mom knew I was home, so Mom would just wake up as long as the porch light was out. I was home. Life was good. My younger brother, around the time that my curfew was, would go downstairs and turn off the porch light. I could come home later. I was confident Mom wouldn't know that I came home late because the porch light was off. Life was good. I knew I could beat the system. I thought I could beat the system. And even if you got busted, it wasn't going to be that big a deal. In organizations, if I truly believe I cannot have the debate, and I truly believe that if I don't follow the program, A, the organization's not likely to know, B, nothing terrible is going to happen to me anyway, I'm going to be unassertive and uncooperative. And I really don't think that's on the employee. I think that's on you as the leader. If you've created that environment, you reap what you sow. I think you need to tear both of those things down. You need to find a way to allow people to be assertive. Look, you can come into my office, shut the door, and explain to me why you think I'm being wrong about something. Do it respectfully, but I'm always comfortable with somebody walking in the door and saying, I think this is a mistake, I disagree, I whatever. And listen to them and truly give their perspective consideration. Let them know that you've heard them. Then they will be willing to be assertive, even if you don't act. But also, and this is one of those critical balances in leadership, I need to be empathetic, I need to be collaborative, I need these people to come in and feel like they can talk to me, etc. But there's also a point in time when as a leader you need to make a decision. We're going to do X. The decision is we will do X. The decision's been made. And now we need to find a way to close the loop, to make sure that we do X. We are going to deliver this to the customer. We will get these things delivered on time. We will change the way we do things and do it this way. Here's the new process, because we found if we didn't follow this process, bad things happened. In hospitals, nurses pass out medications. There is a process. You have to go through the process. You have to come in the room. Hello, Mr. Smith. Verify who the individual is. You have to check, and I don't know all these steps, but you have to check the badge. You have their collar thing they've got on. You've got to make sure the name is right. You've got to ask them about the med. You've got to go through a 3-4 step process before you administer meds. And you've got to follow the process. And if you don't follow the process, even if the right med got to the right person, there will be significant consequences. And there are in hospitals, because hospitals have learned that if we don't have procedures that everybody follows all the time for passing meds, sometimes the wrong med goes to the wrong person, and then people die. and that's very bad. Dead people is bad. So they strongly enforce the process. Therefore, they don't have people being uncooperative of the process because you have no choice. You got to do it. You want people to be able to come in, shut the door, and disagree with you. But once a decision has been made, you need them to know that following through on that decision is something they have to do, and there will be significant consequences to not doing it. That's one of the difficult balances of being a successful leader, being able to do both of those. It's critical to managing conflict successfully. Final approach, highly assertive and highly collaborative. And this is the ideal. This is the golden in many ways. This is what we want to see happening in organizations. Employee walks in, highly assertive. I think we need to do X. I was in an organization and they were talking about, it was a printing company, and they were talking about, do we add a third shift or not? And the first person to speak in this management group was the head of HR, who lobbied and said, no. We should not add a third shift. We should do what we need, add equipment, do things, make the first shift, second shift more productive so we can meet our demand. But let's not add a third shift. And the HR person articulated very sound, rational reasons for not having a third shift. They said, look, third shift tends to be the least experienced employees, newly hired off the street, managed by the least experienced supervisors we have, with no management backup in the building. Third shift tends to be a disaster in many organizations. Relatively low productivity, relatively high error, relatively high scrap rates. Third shift is just a pain to staff and a pain to manage. And went around the room, person B, C, and D talked. And then you went to the QC person. And the QC person said, I think we should have a third shift. They said, in this organization, we do printing, and it was large format printing. And one of the biggest problems they have in that organization, one of their biggest quality problems, was getting the registration right. And I don't want to get overly wonky here, but when you're printing, you've got 3 colors that you're laying down dots of and laying down how much of each of those dots makes all the rest of the colors. If you've ever seen a color picture in the newspaper where the color was clearly off, it was like, here was the picture that didn't look quite right, and then there was a blue that was just a little to the side, that's where the registration was off. Getting the registration right is critical to the success of color printing. In this organization, everything they did was color printing. And he noted that first shift has a terrible problem with the registration being off because their piece of equipment they used at the time, heat, changes the registration. It moves things enough that it created registration problems. So when you start the press in the morning, it was a web-fed operation, as the press gets heated, it moves things, very little bit, but enough to throw off the registration. So that for the first half hour, they were dinking with registration, creating huge quality control, huge loss problems in terms of scrap rate. He goes on and explains all this in much greater detail and much better than I just did. And then they're okay, everybody's talked and had their piece. Well, now the HR person speaks up. HR person says, I think we should have a third shift. A number of people in the organization says, wait, stop, time out. We just heard you pontificate on all the disadvantages of a third shift. They said, yep, I think all those disadvantages are true. And I want to talk about those. But when I listened to the other people in this group, I became convinced that the advantages of a third shift, as articulated by our QC people, outweigh the limitations of a third shift that I perceive, and I think there are ways, if we invest, we can address those limitations of a third shift. So let's find some collaborative ground where we can make this happen. And they went on and talked about getting some of the first shift supervisors to work on the third shift to begin with, getting some of the first and second shift employees on the third shift, bigger shift around. They did all kinds of great things to limit some of the concerns of HR about the third shift. But the key point here was this person was able to be perfect in terms of conflict, highly assertive about what they perceive to be the right answer. You want your employees to be highly assertive. If they know stuff, you want it on the table, but yet highly collaborative, highly cooperative, willing to drop back and say, okay, now that I've heard everybody's perspective, how do we make this happen? My perception as organizations is we're not comfortable enough doing that. We're not good enough at taking a highly assertive position and then taking a highly collaborative one. My impression is that for most of us, we live in world A or world B. My experience has been most managers, their go-to is to be highly assertive about what they think is the right answer. Others of us are highly collaborative and highly good at finding common ground. The great leaders are one who can do both, and the ones that can elicit both out of the other folks in the organization. The ability to be highly assertive and highly collaborative, doing both. And that requires a real mind shift. Part A of the discussion, I'm sharing my perspective from the expertise of the finance department, the second shift, the whatever is your area of expertise in the organization. By the second part of the discussion, I'm now trying to listen to what everybody had to say, consolidate that, and think of a solution that is going to take the best of all of these and combine it to get a really good answer. That requires people who are willing to take two very different perspectives, two different mindsets into a conversation. How am I assertive about what I think is correct, making sure everybody's heard it, and how am I collaborative to make sure that we end up with a solution that takes everybody's outcome into account. Highly assertive, highly collaborative. In many cases, that's ideal. I like, in some cases, being unassertive and cooperative. I can think of very few cases where being uncooperative is good, other than if it's this ethical issue, the kind of thing where you've got lots and lots of investment in it. All right. I want to reinforce, though, the style question. I'm guessing you probably have a go-to style. There's one of these that you naturally tend to gravitate to, but that your style varies significantly depending on the nature of the conflict. If you're having conflict with your boss, you're having conflict with your spouse, you're having conflict with your children, you're having conflict with a neighbor, you're having conflict with subordinate A, you're having conflict with subordinate B. I'm guessing your responses to conflict in every one of those situations can be drastically different, and can be different based on the nature of what you're having conflict over. And that's a good thing. You need to be able to modify your conflict style based on the situation. The biggest point I would make here is you need to be cognizant about those choices. You need to be consciously thinking through as a leader, how am I going to be approaching conflict in this situation? How assertive do I need to be, and how cooperative do I need to be? All right, let's move on to the next topic. How do you structure conflict in your organization in such a way as to have good functional conflict, but not to devolve into negative dysfunctional conflict? Well, I think we need to drop back and look at where conflict is done well, where conflict tends to stay functional. And I would argue that there are two environments where we as a society do conflict very, very well. And one we've already talked about is the judicial system, where there is conflict. Attorney A, Attorney B, they fight, they disagree, they're charged with, their responsibility is to present these alternative perspectives, but it rarely gets to be personal. It rarely devolves into the dysfunctional conflict that we've talked about. Second arena where I think we do a very good job of managing conflict, and we've kind of talked about this already, mentioned it, is athletics. My perception is typically in a sport, particularly a team sport, there is conflict, clearly. Side A wants to win, side B wants to win, but it rarely gets dysfunctional. Even in the tough physical contact sports, even in basketball, which is a contact sport, they're bouncing into each other under the rim. They're bouncing into each other. They're pushing and shoving at some level. And the collision sports like football, like hockey, where people are bouncing into each other. Maybe we need to come back to hockey. But I would argue that in general, these don't result in dysfunctional conflict. You can watch, as you're watching a football game, Green Bay fan, Aaron Rodgers, game's going on, Aaron Rodgers gets sacked. it's not uncommon. He gets sacked, and the guy who just knocked him down, Rodgers is giving him a pat on the ass as he's getting up, or as he's gotten up. Like, oh, that was good. Well done. It doesn't get dysfunctional. I'm not mad at you because you knocked me down. I'm an offensive lineman. I'm trying to knock you down on the defensive line and the other way around. I don't get mad at you because you did your job. If I get mad, I don't act out. I don't rip my helmet off and start beating you in the head with it. Why, in the judicial system and in the athletic arena, do we have conflict that doesn't become dysfunctional? I think there are a number of reasons that result in those conflicts being functional, generally speaking, not dysfunctional. Certainly not an absolute in either arena. One is what I call the green light, and that is there's a clean start to the conflict. So we're going along, we're doing fine, the two attorneys are chatting, the judge, the jury's not there, they're just visiting with each other before court gets in session. The players on the two teams may be visiting with each other before the game, chatting with each other, talking, but there clearly is no conflict yet. The conflict doesn't start until the whistle blows, game is on. So there's a clear delineation. We're in a non-conflict environment. We're getting ready for conflict, but we're not there. Now we're in the conflict arena. A clear green light, a clear beginning to the conflict. My impression is we don't do this well enough in organizations. We don't schedule conflict into our decision making. We more often have a discussion that sometimes conflict breaks out. We shouldn't be doing that. We should have conflict scheduled into the discussion. We should be discussing, should we adopt approach A or approach B to moving into this new market? Well, what are the advantages of approach A? What are the disadvantages of approach A? What are the advantages of B? What are the disadvantages of B? We're effectively putting conflict into this decision. It shouldn't be that people are, well, I'm voting A, and here's why I think A is a good idea. No, I think B is a good idea, and then voting for B. Everybody should be contributing the advantages and disadvantages of A, the advantages and disadvantages of B. You may go a step further. You may divide the team into groups, as we do in national security issues. All right, I want you three folks to go analyze and come up with all the arguments you can for why moving into this new market using approach A is the better answer. You folks, I want you to come up with all the arguments for approach B. And you group over there, try to come up with something else. Come up with some other way that we could go into this new market. And then we're going to come back together and we're going to have a debate. These folks are going to argue for A, they're going to argue. I don't care if you think A is a mistake or not. What you think is the right answer is irrelevant here. I want you to be the attorney arguing for the client is innocent, even if I don't think he is. I want you to be the attorney arguing for the contract's enforceable, even if you think the weight of the argument is probably on the other side. I want you to make the best possible argument for A. I want you to make the best possible argument for B. I want you to make the best possible argument for something else. Conflict doesn't break out at a meeting. Conflict is scheduled in the meeting. We know that it's going to happen. There's no reason to take it personal. If I'm a proponent of A and you're arguing for B, I shouldn't get mad at you because you're arguing for B. You were assigned to B. You're doing what you were charged with doing when you made the argument for B, effectively made the argument you think B's better than A. Conflict shouldn't break out. When it breaks out, it's much more likely to feel dysfunctional. It's much more likely to feel personal. Instead, you write it into the decision. It's part of the decision-making process. We are now going to debate this issue, and as a result, much less likely to be dysfunctional. And now, a few words about some of the programs and services offered by the UW-Oshkosh College of Business.
University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh Master of Business Administration program is powerfully positioned to help you advance your career. Join a strong network of more than 3,700 UWO MBA alumni in the Fox Valley and beyond, and take pride in earning a quality business degree from an AACSB accredited institution. Courses are led by award-winning faculty and industry experts, helping you develop personally and professionally during your time here. Take the first step toward an MBA by visiting uwo.sh/MBA. to see all that UW Oshkosh has to offer. That's uwo.sh/MBA. Apply today.
2, the conflict. This is if green light is the first step of conflict. Conflict is on. In sports, in the judicial system, we have clear process where it now starts. Now you have what I call rules of the game, codes of conduct, norms of behavior. Call it what you want. But there are rules around how this conflict will play itself out. And in sports, be it the rule book in the NFL or the Major League Baseball, what have you, or be it in the legal environment where there are rules around evidence and how you conduct yourself in the courtroom, there are clear, understood rules for how this conflict is going to play itself out. And there's a clear way to enforce those rules. In the judicial system, there is a judge. And if the attorneys cross a line to things that are inappropriate given the judicial rules of how court etiquette should proceed, they will be admonished by the judge that their behavior is not in conformity with the rules of how conflict should play itself out. And if push comes to shove, the judge can go as far as imprisoning the person. They can put him in jail. You could be disbarred and lose your license and inability to practice law if you've crossed the line in an inappropriate way. In the sports arena, there's a whistle and there's a penalty and the other team gets free throws, or there's yardage that's awarded one way or the other. So there are real costs. You're ejected from the game. So there are real costs to not following the rules. We need to mirror this in organizations. We need to have understood codes of conduct. When we have conflict in the organization, when we're having a debate over approach A or approach B to moving into this new market, we have maybe a literally listed out code of conduct. Here are 5 rules, guidelines for how we're going to conduct ourselves. We will listen to each other. We will not interrupt. When we disagree, we'll disagree about the issue. We will not make personal attacks. Here are the 3, 4, 5 things that we think should guide how we approach this conflict. And these things can evolve over time. One company I was working with had a guideline when we first started this that said no personal attacks. And after a couple of weeks, they got rid of that and put a new rule in. You're supposed to make personal attacks as long as they're not cruel, I think was their terminology, because they made fun of each other and they poked fun, and they didn't want to stop poking fun, but they didn't want it to be cruel. They didn't want it to be overly personal. So they modified it. But you have a code of conduct, and you have some way to enforce it, a written code or an understood rule code, and you have some way to enforce it. You're at a team meeting and somebody has crossed a line. You have some way to say, wait a minute, time out. I think the way we are now managing this conflict violates the norms we have as an organization, and we need to deal with this. And in my mind, that trumps the particular decision that you're making. You call a timeout and say, wait a minute, I think we violated our code of conduct. I think you've used abusive language. I think something has happened that's inappropriate. Let's talk about that, get resolution to that, then we can go and move on. One of the organizations I've worked with, they throw stuffed fish. So they just have stuffed fish in their meeting rooms, little plush stuffed fish, not the trophy fish. And if employee A thinks that somebody's violated the code of conduct, they can pick up one of the fish and hit somebody else with it. And the idea is, A, people should laugh. If you're at a business meeting and somebody throws a fish at you, you should laugh. You shouldn't get mad. But the other thing is you've done something fishy, and then the meeting sort of stops. Okay, Bob, you just threw the fish. What do you think? What's your concern? And then there's discussion. Yes, no, there wasn't a violation of code of conduct. What do we do about it? We sort that out. Once we get that resolved, then we go back to the focus of the meeting. My perception is organizations need to have a good code of conduct, which is understood, written or unwritten, but an understanding of how we fight, and they need some way to enforce it. I would contend that most of you that are in successful marriages, successful relationships, have a code of conduct. That there are disagreements that happen in a marriage. That's just the way it works. But you have found ways to have that conflict, to have that debate within arenas that avoid it getting dysfunctional. There are things that you're not allowed to say, things that you might think, but you don't say, you don't cross the line, because that's not how you fight. And you have to have found a way to disagree successfully, to have functional conflict, or else a marriage doesn't work. You're never all going to be always on the same page. That ain't going to happen. And you can't just have one person who says, well, I'll just tell you what the answer is, because the other person, in my perspective, would be dominated, and that would not be healthy or fair. So you need to have green light. Conflict is on. You need to have yellow light. Here are the bounds and the rules around how we have conflict, and you need to have some way to enforce that conflict. And you need to then have red light. You need to have a clear understanding of now the conflict is over. This is a problem in organizations. I see conflict in organizations dragging on and on and on. And that becomes dysfunctional. We're going to the third meeting to discuss approach A versus approach B. We've already had this discussion. We haven't gotten to consensus. Since we haven't gotten to consensus, we're going to keep talking about it. And now I'm getting annoyed. I know what you're going to say before you say it. You know what my counter is going to be before I say it. So we go through the ritual of having this debate again, and it doesn't move us forward. No. Clear end of the conflict. There needs to be a point where you say, this is over. As the leader in the organization, if there's a group, reports to you, they're having debate, we're getting perspectives, all this debate back and forth, you've had good, assertive perspectives from all of the individuals, they've worked collaboratively to try to come up with a solution, but they haven't come up to a solution. There hasn't been a consensus decision that you think makes sense. At some point, you as the leader need to say, stop, time out, got it. I think I've heard everybody in the room, and you may echo back what everybody has said to make sure everybody understands that, yes, you understand their perspective. Let me think about it. I'll get back to you. You go back to your office, you think about it, you do whatever analysis you need to do, then you walk into the next meeting and say, here's the answer. We're going to do B. We're going to take approach B to moving into this new market. I think that's the best answer. I've understood parts of A. Maybe we're just doing B. Maybe there's a modified version of B. This is what we're going to do. And at that point, there is no more debate. There's a great scene in the movie Dances with Wolves, where if you remember the movie, this is a Kevin Costner movie. He's in the cavalry, Civil War days, but he gets shipped out to the Indian lands, and he gets to a fort that there's no fort, and he's trying to make the fort there by himself, and he really starts living with the Indians. He gets very connected to the Indians. And he's with the Indians, and the Indians are now seeing more and more settlers coming into their territory, taking their land, taking their territory, and there's a meeting with a bunch of the Indians having a discussion around what should we do in the face of this. Do we just move further west? Do we fight? What do we do? And there's this robust discussion and debate. And then this old guy, who's clearly the guy, and I don't know if the movie is at all accurate to Native American lore, to Native American dress, but he's dressed, costumed in a way that certainly makes it look like he's the guy. And he says, well, I think we should do bum, bum, bum. And then very humbly and very quietly he says, that's all I have to say. And what did he really just say? His words were, that's all I have to say. But as soon as he said it, everybody else got up, left, went about their business of proceeding with what he had said. Because when he said, that's all I have to say, what he really said was, that's all anybody has to say. I have now made the decision, and we are moving forward. In organizations, there comes a time when somebody has to make the decision. Allowing the debate and the conflict to drag on is only going to result in that conflict becoming dysfunctional. At some point, a leader in the organization needs to stand up. My responsibility, my authority, we're going to do X. We will continue down the road of X. We might revisit it in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is, but for now, I want everybody committed to X. And the debate is now over. I expect everybody to get in line and support X, because that's the decision that's been made. If you want to go and have a debate about the wisdom of doing X, that's great, fine. But do it on your own dime. Don't do it on company time, because we are now about the business of how do we do the best we possibly can to implement this decision. My experience in organizations is that we don't do a good job of starting green light. Generally, we don't do a great job of managing conflict, some organizations better than others. And in many cases, we don't do a good job of red light. We don't do a good job of ending the conflict in the debate. I'm convinced that if you're going to have successful conflict in your organization, you're going to have good functional conflict, you need to be good at green light, you need to be good at yellow light, you need to be good at red light. Unless you know how to start the conflict, manage the conflict, and end the conflict, you will have dysfunctional conflict. If you can do these things well, you will have good functional conflict. You'll get all of these advantages of conflict that I talked about, and you'll avoid the disadvantages of dysfunctional conflict. All right, now, a couple of final thoughts. One, how do we get ready for the conflict that we're going to have in many cases in organizations when we have change? And what I want to think a little bit about is what we call force field analysis. So this is, we're going to have a change. We know there's likely to be some support, some lack of support for this change. Everybody's not going to think it's a great idea. How do we conceptualize it? How do we think about this moving forward? And I found a very, very useful tool is what we call force field analysis. What this basically involves, what are the supportive, what are the restraining forces? So as I think about it, to use a personal example as opposed to a business one, exercise and diet. I think it's desirable to have good diet and to do an appropriate amount of exercise. There are supporting forces that encourage me to have good exercise and to have good diet. There are restraining forces that discourage me from having good exercise and good diet. In an organization, what you want to do is you want to list those out. So if it's a wellness program, we want to encourage exercise and diet. I want to go to my employees and say, what are the supporting forces? What are the reasons? What are the driving forces that motivate you to exercise and to diet? And people will talk about living longer and being healthier and having more energy and looking better and a whole bunch of supportive forces. And then they'll have a whole host of restraining forces. Well, the unhealthy food tastes pretty doggone good. In some cases, it's cheaper. It's work to exercise. This food is cheaper that isn't as healthy for you. I don't know how to exercise. I'm not sure what exercise is to do. I'm afraid I'd hurt myself or I'd look stupid exercising. The organization can then go about the business of saying, how do we turn up the noise on the supporting forces and turn down the noise on the restraining forces? What do we do to result in people thinking more about the supporting forces, less on the restraining? So we encourage them to think about the exercise benefits in terms of health and well-being. And we talk about people that are older that have exercised a lot and had a full and healthy life and have lots of energy when they're in their 80s and 90s. And my 92-year-old mother, and I think about that because that's a good example of exercise and how it goes. And then you try to attack the restraining forces. Well, I don't know what exercises to do. I don't have time to go to the gym. Well, many corporate facilities now have, okay, we're going to deal with that. We have exercise facilities in the corporate headquarters. We have an exercise physiologist. We have a physical therapist. We have somebody who's there in the exercise arena ready to help train you on what exercises to do. We subsidize your Y membership. In the company cafeteria, we make sure we have healthy foods that are in fact cheaper than the less healthy foods. We'll sell you the apple for almost nothing. Yeah, you can have a piece of cream pie, but that's going to be a little more expensive. You modify the environment to increase the supporting forces, reduce the constraining forces. And you might want to do that by group, because everybody in the organization might not have the same set of supporting and restraining forces, and therefore you want to subdivide this by group so you understand, for new employees, how do they view it? For employees who've been around for a while, for employees Division A versus Division B, the first shift versus the third shift, the accounting folks versus the finance folks versus the IT folks. There may be all kinds of divisions by race, by gender, by what have you, that would give them a different set of supportive and restraining forces. And understanding what those supportive and restraining forces are for each of those subgroups will give you insight into, will that subgroup tend to be supportive naturally or restraining, opposed, and what can you do to modify to gain their support, or at least to be aware they're not naturally going to be very supportive. So we're going to have to find things to do to make that happen. Finally, want to think a little bit about how do you resolve dysfunctional conflict if it's occurred. Because there are times when you're going to have dysfunctional conflict. It's happened, it's there, it's a cancer on your organization, bad things are happening, and you need to find a way to make it go away. Well, let me start with some really bad ideas for managing conflict that has broken out, that has become dysfunctional. And you might ask the question, well, why should you tell us about bad ideas? I need to learn good ideas. Well, there are 4 bad ideas I want to talk about, and all 4 of these are things that I see people doing all the time, and they don't work. It does not work to ignore it. You've got dysfunctional conflict in the organization. If you ignore it, the odds are it will get worse. The odds are exceedingly slight that it will just go away on its own. Increasing contact. You got 2 people that are not playing nice together. I know I'll put them in a car, have them drive to St. Louis together, and because they got to drive to St. Louis to this convention together, they'll, on the drive, learn how to like each other. Well, I don't believe that just spending more time with someone you don't like will naturally lead to your liking this person. If this happened, we wouldn't have the divorce rate we have in the United States today. Spending more time with somebody you're frustrated with probably gives you more reasons to be frustrated with them as opposed to resolving. So increasing contact doesn't happen. Leader negotiate doesn't happen. Leader comes in and says, okay, party A, what happened? Party B, what happened? Okay, fine. I think the solution is X. What do y'all think? Well, everybody's going to say yes to whatever the boss says. What else are they going to say? And they've both lied to you about what happened because they've tried to present it in a way that makes them look like the daggone hero. So leader negotiation, in my mind, is simply not a very successful approach. A final unsuccessful approach is leader repression. Boss calls them both in and says, look, I don't want you two to fight anymore. Stop fighting and go away. All that's going to happen is they're going to stop fighting in front of you. You've now got conflict that's going on, but it's sort of below the surface, which if anything makes it worse, not better. Repressed conflict does not cause the conflict to go away. It causes it to simmer. It causes it to exacerbate. These things do not work. Here are some good ideas. Here are some ways to deal with dysfunctional conflict. And these are a mix of ideas that work if you're the leader and you're trying to mediate, not resolve, but mediate the conflict, get these parties to solve it themselves with some help, or if you're in the middle of conflict and you're one of the players involved. So you can kind of listen to these from both of these perspectives. One is remain calm. Don't get upset. It won't help. Trust me, it won't help. You may very well have been in a scenario where you were in the middle of some conflict and you thought of something to say and you knew it'd feel really good to say it. It would really be a great stick in the eye of the other person. But it's a stick in the eye of the other person. Saying it would feel really good, but it would really not help the situation. Here's a very insightful suggestion. Don't say that stuff. Remain calm. Keep your emotions out of it. I learned early on from my grandfather when I was in high school. He was telling me that if he was in a meeting, he was a superintendent, ran electrical construction jobs, big jobs back in the Second World War, that he'd sometimes have a dozen people in a meeting, and they're getting upset. The electrical union, this union, that union, they're not in agreement, the owner, and they're all getting mad and yelling at each other. Said, if you were the person that remained calm, you would win. Losing your control does not result in the outcome you want. You have to control your emotion. You have to walk in centered, grounded, and remain calm. One of the ways I like to do that is I ask myself a very simple question. Do I really care? And yeah, I care about my work, But fundamentally, do I really care? Is this going to adversely affect my wife, my children's spouses, my grandchildren? If you ain't hurting one of those 4 groups of people, then I don't really care. Don't sweat the little stuff. And if you're not hurting one of these 4 people, it's all little stuff. Don't get so emotionally attached that you can't remain calm when you're discussing this. Getting upset won't help. 2, help the other person or persons to remain calm. Now, how do you do this? I have found an amazingly successful technique, which is amazingly simple, is simply to state, we don't do that. So you see the other party or one of the parties in this discussion starting to get upset. You simply look at them and say, no, stop, time out. We don't do that here. We're not going to get emotionally amped up as we're discussing how to deal with this particular issue. Getting emotionally amped up is not going to help us solve the problem, so we're not going to do that. If you need to take a minute, you want to take a little walk, you want to get a drink, water, and come back and continue the conversation, great, fine. But we don't do that. And it amazes me how well that works. Once you just say, no, we don't do that, it's like, oh, okay, so I won't. Focus on ideas, not on the people. Don't focus on personalities. Don't let them focus on the personalities. Focus on the idea. It's the basic difference between functional and dysfunctional. Let's talk about the issue and not talk about people and personalities. Remember your common objectives, the distinction between means and ends. And I believe this is a distinction that we don't spend nearly enough time reminding ourselves of. In our society today, it is very common and very considered insightful to note that we are a highly divided society and people are at each other's throats and we're more divided than we've ever been before and there's all this division within the country. Well, yes, no, I'm old. I remember Vietnam. I remember Martin Luther King's assassination. I know people are upset at each other. I know you got people that are this side of the political spectrum, that side of the political spectrum, they get all upset. But that's not new. We don't have riots in the street. I really don't think the division is all that bad. More importantly, I am totally convinced it's a means-end question. If I ask the question, the people on this side of the political spectrum, do they love their country? Do they love their spouses? Do they love their kids? Are they basically good people that want to do good things and make the world a better place? Yeah. What about the other side of the spectrum? Do they believe all that stuff? Yeah. I don't care which side of the political aisle you're on. I believe the vast, vast majority of folks want to make good things happen. They disagree, maybe extremely disagree about the ends to make it happen. But if we remind ourselves that we are disagreeing about ends, not about means, it makes it less personal. It allows us to drop back and say, okay, I think this is a better way to get this outcome. In this organization, we want to find a way to increase the profitability of the organization, gain market share, and create a great place for people to work. We all agree that's the objective. I think we ought to do it by introducing this product. You think we ought to do it by taking the products we already sell and moving them to a different market. Different means to the same end. As long as we're agreeing we're after the same end, it's less likely I'm going to get upset with you for having a different means to the end. I'm convinced that reminding people of shared ends in mind reduces the angst that comes from recognizing there are differences in means. Diversity. Appreciating diversity. I don't think we approach diversity right yet in our society from two perspectives. I think we need to be broader in our identification of diversity, and I think we need to be having a different goal. Diversity, very broadly, whether you're talking race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, you've been in the military, you haven't been in the military, you've lived all your life in Wisconsin, you're from accounting, finance, marketing, HR, all of the diversities you can think of, I'm convinced are hugely valuable to an organization. Too often we talk about tolerating diversity and understanding and accepting diversity. In my mind, that's way too low a bar. from a conflict resolution perspective, we should be celebrating diversity. If I've got a team that is made up of people that are all like me, well, that's terrible. First of all, can you imagine a team of 10 Dales in a room? That would just be painful. But beyond that, what am I going to learn? I know the stuff I know. I need people in the team that are different from me. I don't want to build a team of people that are like me. That's repeating what I've already got. We need to increasingly relish in the diversity. The fact that you disagree with me on the right means to achieve this end should not be something that I get frustrated about. That should be something I should celebrate. How do I use that? How do we get to a better final product, a better final approach, because we are using diversity of perspective to result in an improved decision in the end result? Related to that is mutual respect. The more that we respect the other people we work with, we think of them as fundamentally good, competent individuals, the less likely you are to get upset with them when you disagree. They're smart, they're creative, they're caring, they're compassionate. Kind of hard to get mad at them just because they have a different approach to solving a particular problem. The other thing is to remember that sometimes you've screwed up. A certain level of humbleness from everybody involved in conflict is helpful. Remember, everybody in the room, we're debating this. I know these people are having dysfunctional conflict, but I want every one of you to ask the question, have you ever been wrong? Have you ever promoted some answer that turned out not to be the ideal solution? All right, in theory, consider the possibility that in this particular case, you might be wrong. If I can own that I might be wrong and the other person might be right, even if I don't start advocating their position, I'm a little less upset that they're taking a different perspective. Because in the end result, I might be wrong. Expand the issue. I'm a big fan of expanding the issue. Within the university environment, one of the things we can debate about is who's going to teach which course. So every semester, we're looking at these are the courses we need to teach in my department, who's going to teach which course, and it's a zero-sum game. We can't both teach the same course, and there may be two people that want to teach a particular course, nobody wants to teach that course, somebody wins, somebody loses. So there's going to be conflict, and it could get dysfunctional because people get upset because they don't get the course they want, so it may turn personal. But if we expand the issue, we go from discussing which courses you're going to teach this semester to which course you're going to teach this semester, which course you're going to teach next semester, what days of the week are you going to teach, which hours of the days are you going to teach. Now we can do some horse trading. If all we're talking about is who in this hospital has to work Christmas, we're going to fight about that. Much more likely, it's going to be much harder to get a solution. If we take all of the holidays of the year, now we can start doing some discussion and some trading and some back and forth. Well, yeah, I can work Christmas. My kids are all grown. They're out of the house. The grandkids are at a distance. So sure, I'll cover Christmas so you folks can have Christmas off. But Thanksgiving is really big to me because that's a family thing, and we always watch the football games and lots of family traditions, so I'd really like to have Thanksgiving off. 4th of July. 4th of July, this is not true for me. 4th of July, the in-laws always come over, and they spend the weekend for the 4th of July. Yeah, I'll work the 4th of July weekend. So it could be that people are willing to do some trading if you expand the issues. If you only give them one topic, much less likely. Another thing is give them control. Don't go to them and say, okay, these three parts of the organization, everybody propose your budget to me, I'll look at the budget and I'll decide how much everybody gets. No, I'm going to decide the total number. I'm going to give it to the various parts of the organization, and y'all are going to have to figure out how you're going to split it up across these three different capital projects that we're going to be utilizing. And if you can't decide, I'll decide, and none of you will probably like my decisions. Give people control over the thing they're debating. Give the 5 nurses control over who's going to work which holidays. Don't have them all give a shtick to me on what I want, and then as a leader, I identify who gets which holidays. They're all going to get mad at you. Give them the authority, give them the power somehow to make the decision. Give them ownership of the source of the conflict. And finally, reduce fear of failure. People are much more nervous about conflict. They're much more likely to get personal about these things if they feel like, if I get this wrong, somebody's going to be in trouble. And now we're going to fight about who screwed it up. It's the old story. You can try and fix the problem, or you can fix the blame, but you don't get to do both. If you're fixing the blame, if we have to know who was at fault for this mistake, and we're going to focus on finding that person and making them pay, you're never going to figure out who was at fault, and no one's going to be willing to talk about how to fix the system, how to fix the problem. Don't focus on fear, focus on solving the problem. I'm hugely convinced that if in your organization you move conflict from a bad thing to a good thing, and you focus on how do we use conflict to enhance the quality of decision making in your organization, you will have a happier organization, you will have way less dysfunctional conflict, and you will be a more successful organization. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you have any questions you'd like us to approach in any of these leadership podcasts, please let us know. Shoot me an email, Feinauer, Feinauer, @uwosh.edu, with any suggestions you have, any questions you'd like us to be addressing in these leadership podcasts. Thank you.
It's Time is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh College of Business graduate programs in association with Venture Project Studios. Executive producer, Aaron J. Armstrong. Host, Professor Dale Feinauer. Creative Director, Madison Potratz. Director of Photography, Elazar Kloon. Audio and Video Editor, Elazar Kloon. Marketing Strategy, Tara Larson. Social Media, Anwar Mahana. A special thanks to L Creative, Top View Media, Michael Patton, and the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh College of Business graduate programs.